Uh, it is just fun to be able to come on a Sunday and talk about Mongol rule in the Islamic world, right? Pure nerdy history. There's so much of this topic that I can, even as an introduction, it's hard to introduce it in an hour. So in order to have some depth, I thought, why not do this? Why not just do a sampling of the primary sources from the first century, the beginning, the early 13th century to early 14th century. And by primary sources, just to make sure we're on the same page, what do we mean by primary sources? By sources, we mean source of information. How do we know about this history? And by primary, it's not really as a primary, as a main or first, it's more like direct. So it's like direct sources of information, right? So basically, for example, if in the 13th century, the Mongols were forging their empire and someone saw what the Mongols did and they wrote it down, that written record becomes a primary source of information. So primary or not, it's relative to how close the record is to the story or event itself. And then when there's a primary, there's probably a secondary, right? When people say secondary sources, that means later on when others write about this history, discuss this history based on information they learn from the primary sources, that becomes a secondary sources. So for example, when one of our good professors in the universities write a book on the Mongols, that will be a secondary source. But then now secondary sources are of course very valuable. They can give us summaries of what the various primary sources say, so it makes it for easy reading. And secondary sources can be scholarship on very specific questions, explored in depth, questions that are not obviously answered just by the primary sources. So they're good for summaries, they're good for in-depth engagement of specific questions. But then if any secondary source has any merit at all, it would be because it's an accurate understanding of the primary sources. Right? So that by sampling primary sources, essentially, and this is really my motive, my agenda today is so that you will know where the information lies, where the treasure, where the booty lies, right? So then essentially the thing that I went to graduate school for, really there's no trade secret. You can pretty much just read about, access the same things with these primary sources. That's really what historians are supposed to do, just read these records about the past and try to gain some measure of understanding from them. Yeah, so hopefully then, I will share a bibliography at the end. But please, if I forget, tell me about it. Tell me to do it. I'll put it in the chat. But
Sure.
yes, Mongols. All right, primary sources. Before we talk about these written records on the Mongols, I would just quickly like to give an overview of the history, the background. Mongols as a people, right? We know they're from Mongolia, but now if we look at the map, right, back in the late 12th century, Mongols were one of multiple steppe nomadic peoples in what we will call Mongolia today. To their north, if we can keep it in mind, there's a powerful tribe called the Merkit. To their, they would be one of the early enemies of the Mongols. To their south, we see Kiryat. They would initially be actually allies of the Mongols, but eventually the Mongols swallow them all up. So that, notice how we hear of Mongolia in a Mongolian language. We don't hear about a Merketia or a Kiryatia, even though they would have spoken the same language at the time. Now they were also surrounded by peoples who spoke Turkic languages, say like the Naiman, the Kyrgyz, eventually, the Kyrgyz, or this doesn't apply, but the Naiman, they were swallowed up by the Mongols as well. And it was actually through the Naimans that the Mongols found out about written language for government use, for chancellor use. And it was then that the Mongols developed their own written language. It was through the Naimans that they conquered. Now, the steppe, right? It basically means vast grasslands. And if we look at the picture on the right, it's the grasslands. Some herdsmen have their hay. So when you're on the grasslands, right, this is your main source of economic production. Your horses, your sheep, your cattle, you're always trying to find good grazing grounds, good pastures for them. So, and then that would usually involve movements depending on the season. Right? There are summer pastures and winter pastures. Yes. So it is, and it's important to contrast this with the agricultural parts of the world, with their neighbors. The Islamic world of Central Asia and Iran, with agrarian populations, and that would support large cities, as well as, of course, China to the south. And so, stark contrast in terms of economic ways of life, and that, as in general, the steppe was poor compared to the agricultural parts. Why? For the roughly the same amount of acreage, amount of land, less calories can be produced from those animals than from, say, grains. And this made Mongols, or actually steppe nomads in general, heavily dependent on trade with or pillage of the sedentary peoples. So things like iron and salt were hard to come by. If the steppe nomads got tea, that would have been for the aristocracy. Right? Tea, most of us probably had a cup before coming, but that was not to be taken granted for steppe nomads. And speaking of pillaging, they had the basis for that in great part thanks to those very adorable horses. Right? Now, the Mongol horses, if you notice in the picture, they're not that big. Right? The man on the horse is fairly, you can see the horse's head doesn't come too high relative to his neck. But these horses are durable. They're smaller, but durable is not the right word. They have high endurance. Right? They're not that fast relative to big, huge European horses, but they can sustain themselves over long distances. And a Mongol warrior, under normal circumstances, would actually bring on multiple horses per person per campaign. So then horses take turns, and that carrying the rider, and that really gives the whole army great distance. And just one more thing to notice about the horses is that you will see the stirrup, right? I put a red mark under the man's foot. That stirrup, where they put the settle the foot in, it may not look like high tech to us, but it was a world-changing technology, because with the stirrup, right, the rider's stable. And when the rider's stable, that makes horse archery with two hands, right? Bow and arrow, two hands. That makes it so much easier. And horse archery was just a key combat power for the Mongols. Sometimes in the movies, they like to show Mongol warriors with sword in hand, right? Brave cavalry charge and hand-to-hand combat. But really, if the enemy could be shot at a distance, that's what the Mongol warrior would have preferred. Okay, so essentially, we have hardy, very hardy people in the grasslands, very cold during the winter, with their horses, but with lots of scarcity in terms of variety of goods that their neighbors happen to have. And in this very basic backdrop, right, we have in the late 12th century, early 13th century, the rise of a man called Temujin. His name was Temujin. Very, very brief bio about him and his family, right? That's 1162 to 1227 was his lifespan. He, through a mix of personal charisma, sound leadership, and strategy and sound strategy and tactics, he conquered or co-opted all of the steppe nomads in what is roughly present-day Mongolia. And with that, he took on the title Chinggis Khan. We're not quite sure what Chinggis means, scholars debated, but Chinggis or Genghis in English, that's a title. And Khan or Khan, they're the same thing. That basically means the king, the ruler. Right, so Chinggis Khan was the title. Temujin is his name. And the state he founded, they call it the Mongol Ulus. Right? Mongol is Mongol, and Ulus is a political community of people. And by the way, today's Mongolia actually still calls itself that, essentially, right? With a slight variation in vowels. But yes, so the Mongol Ulus was the Mongol state in essence. He had a principal wife, and by principal, it implies that yes, he had other wives, but his principal wife, Borte, essentially his empress or queen, they were married, but soon after they were married, the Borte was captured in a raid by the Merakit. Remember the Merakit tribe to the north of the Mongols? And it was a brief period, relatively brief period of captivity. Temujin, later Chinggis, was able to rescue her. But soon after she was rescued, her eldest son, and if we look down at the bottom, her eldest son, Juchi, was born. So, first son, Juchi, because of this, Chinggis Khan, Temujin never publicly said that Juchi is not his son. But because of this incident, there just was doubt that, well, who was Juchi's father, biological father? We'll come back to the story as when we talk about one of our primary sources. And then he went on to have more sons with Borte, Jaadai, Ogadai, who later became his successor as Khan, and Tule. And he had, of course, other sons, but it's these sons and these sons' descendants who would later on rule parts of his domain. So very quick biography of Chinggis Khan. Now, we're talking about, we really care today about the Mongol rule in the Islamic world, right? So very brief, how did that happen? 1219 to 1221, right? The Mongols attacked a domain, a state, if you will, of the Khorazm Shah, and that's a title. And the title holder's name is Ala ad-Din Muhammad bin Tarikh. Now, who is he? Khorazm Shah. Khorazm is a region not quite big, just south of the Aral Sea. Right? If you see the Caspian Sea to its east, that pocket of water is the Aral Sea. Just south of that, not too big of a region, is Khorazm. Shah means king, so king of Khorazm, if you will. Now, as I said, Khorazm is not very big, but if you see the Sultanate of Khorazm as labeled on the map, it's quite big, right? Basically, most of Iran and large tracts of Central Asia. What is this all about? Essentially, Ala ad-Din Muhammad bin Tarikh, from now on, I just call him Sultan Muhammad. Sultan Muhammad's ancestors were made Khorazm Shah, essentially as a vassal by the Seljuks. Right? The Seljuk Turks of the 11th century were the predominant power in the Islamic world. So they started in this world as subordinates of the Seljuks, and they gradually grew their empire, grew their domain into an empire. Sultan Muhammad was, in fact, an empire builder himself. Right? He was responsible for this fairly vast state. And by all accounts, the Mongols, ironically, though they were conquerors, they didn't at least plan to attack Sultan Muhammad at least not in 1219. What happened was, and accounts Mongol and non-Mongol agree on this pretty much, is that Chinggis Khan sent a caravan of traders to the territory of the Sultan. And one of the Sultan's noblemen, coveting after the treasure, the goods, the money of this caravan, executed them, calling them spies. And that enraged Chinggis Khan. And then Chinggis Khan sent an embassy of diplomats to ask for essentially the arrest of this nobleman, who happened to be called Khair Khan. Not very, Khair means good, but apparently not a very good man, not a man of good omens. And the Sultan refused. Sultan Muhammad refused. Chinggis Khan, for that reason, couldn't let it pass, and the Mongols were outraged. They attacked. And to do so, they actually had to conquer another empire in between, and that's the one called the Tarikh-e Khaganate on the map. Right? That was actually a Buddhist dynasty reigning over a Muslim population. So the Mongols really had to cross pretty long distances to attack the Sultan. The Mongols won, and Sultan Muhammad didn't really put up a good fight, but his son, mentioned here, Jalal ad-Din Menguberdi, did. Okay. So this was really the beginning of Mongol conquest and the establishment of their rule in the Islamic world. So with this backdrop, let's sample our primary sources. Right? Primary sources, the good stuff. The first source I like to introduce is called The Secret History of the Mongols. Why is this important? In terms of history, like when we think of history, it's at least some sort of chronicle gives us quite a bit of dates, events, and stories, right? This is the only one in Mongolian. That's still around today. That survived, and there are other materials in Mongolian from the period, but they're kind of short. They're basically just documents or very, very short text. This is a whole history, and it's called Secret History of the Mongols. What's secret about it? It seems to be that it was not intended for a general audience. It was only for the ruling family, and interestingly, it was what you see here, right, are Chinese characters. The language is Mongolian, but it's written using the Chinese script. So I guess that also adds on a level of secrecy, right? You have to know you have to know Mongolian. You have to know that language, but you'd also have to know the Chinese script to make out the sounds. Yes, and it's thanks to the scholars, I think about a century or so ago, who discovered this, that we at least have one primary source in Mongolian, and it's a source that's fairly early on, roughly it should be during the time of Chinggis Khan's son Ogedai, his successor. So now, I just want to say every primary source I share today, with very few exception, is going to be in the bibliography, and they have English translation. So I just like to share would you please just read with me, right? Because I don't want to just say this is a primary source, it exists, and go on to the next one. So it's like, if I'm going to tell you about delicious food, I also would like you to just try some. So let's just read. Let's just go in and read a little bit. Context. Sorry. A little bit of context. This is on the eve of the invasion of the Islamic world, the campaign against Sultan Muhammad. Chinggis Khan held a great council of his family and nobles, and they were going to. A question was raised as to who is going to succeed Chinggis Khan. He's an old man at this time, right? So the question of succession came up, and Chinggis Khan is about to speak. He spoke to Juchi. So Chinggis Khan to Juchi. Juchi, my eldest son, what do you say? But before Juchi could utter a sound, Cha'adai, the second son, said, "By telling Juchi to speak, are you saying that you nominate him as your successor? How could we be governed by a bastard of the Mirkids?" Juchi rose, seized Cha'adai's collar, and said, "Our father the Khan has never informed me that I am any different from you. Why do you discriminate against me? In what way are you more able than I? Only in terms of stupidity are you perhaps superior. If you beat me in long-distance arrow shooting, I will cut off my thumb and cast it away. If you defeat me in wrestling, I will not rise from the ground where I fall. Let our father the Khan decree which one of us shall succeed him." Juchi and Cha'adai stood holding each other by the collar, while Borochu pulled on Juchi's arm and Mukhali pulled on Cha'adai's arm. Chinggis Khan himself sat listening in silence. Right. Now, first of all, one reason I chose this passage of all is that there's something relatable, right? We can understand what this is, even though this is from 800 years ago, from a very distant culture and society. Right? It's not that this is inaccessible to us, to our understanding. Right? And two brothers had each other's collars. Two noblemen, I colored their names, Borochu and Mukhali. They, by the way, are two of Chinggis Khan's most trusted generals, trying to just break up the fight. And these words, right? These words that Cha'adai and Juchi spoke, right? They are human. And it's from reading primary sources, right? And that we get to approach this. We get to see, right, that these are human beings. They have experiences that could have lessons for us. I also think that perhaps if we read into it a little more, right, there's even wisdom to be gained from it. If we think about it, Chinggis Khan sat listening in silence. Now, he's the most powerful man in the steppe. They're talking about invading Sultan Muhammad and choosing his successor. He's presiding now, but he's in silence. Was he so powerless as to stop this exchange of insults? Probably not. Notice it's Borochu and Mukhali, right? These two of his most trusted top generals, pulling the two brothers away from each other. It's as if Borochu and Mukhali's more worried about these two going after each other than Chinggis Khan is. But if we think about it, right, Chinggis Khan's this shows his political skill, if you will, his innate astuteness. Right? He's watching this. Right? His two top generals are showing their loyalty. Right? And as far as the sons, I'd have to say, compared to their father and to Borochu, Borochu and Mukhali, they're kind of dumb. They're kind of dumb. I mean, just look at the words of Juchi, right? Sorry, talking about wrestling, right, and arrow shooting, as if that's what it takes to be successor to Chinggis Khan, right? To be the best archer and the best wrestler on the steppe. So Juchi pretty much squandered his chance. And Cha'adai, it's hard to say. Cha'adai, by embarrassing his father like this in front of everyone, I think he pretty much ruined his chance. But if we read further in the Secret of History of the Mongols, it might be because he just wanted to ruin Juchi's chance. And as it turned out, their younger brother, Ogadai, and please remember this, Ogadai became the successor. So a sampling of the secret history of the Mongols in Mongolian. That's the Mongolian script. And yeah, so the invasion took place. Successor was chosen. Okay, Ogadai, and now we can invade. All right, invasion took place. Sultan Muhammad defended poorly, but he died during this war, and his son Jalal ad-Din Menguberdi put up strong resistance. And that brings us to another source I'd really like to introduce. It's called Tarikh-e jahangushay, translated as History of the World Conqueror. It's written in Persian, and it was written in the age of Chinggis Khan's grandson, Mongol Khan. And again, this is just a sampling, a sample of a passage from a very, very long history book that I would like to share with, like us to just share. And the translations in English, of course, and I know many of us here in the audience reads Persian. So how about this? I won't read this time. Let's just give it a minute. You can, if you, and depending on which language you prefer, could you please read this? And for the Persian reading audience, I just want to give one quick note. So at the beginning, it starts with Chun Chinggis Khan Yasa Risani Debud. Yasa Risani Dan, that just means, think of Yasa. Yasa means law in Mongolian. In this context, it really means command. So think of it as law. Laws are essentially permanent commands to the Mongols. The word comes from Mongolian jasa. So yasa is like a command. It's like farman, amr. So please, let's take a minute and just read this passage. All right, thank you. So yeah, we have a battle described here in the works of, the author of this history is Atta Malik bin Muhammad Juwayni. So it's for short, Juwayni's Tarikh-e jahangushay. And now, again, we have characters, we have action right? Like a lot of histories written in Persian, the writer likes to put in verses of poetry, like, or sometimes just really poetry in it. So some literary embellishments, and it's again window into people's psychology, mindset. Look what Chinggis Khan has been quoted as saying, seeing the brave fight that Jalal ad-Din put up, right? Such a son must a father have. And in terms of have, just to be sure, it's really such a son must a father sire, right? In Persian, aspedar, pisar chunin boyad. So aspedar is like such a son from a father. So such a son, a father should sire. And look who he's saying this to. Right? He's saying to his sons, right? So we can almost see like he's not that impressed with his own sons probably. So he's saying, give me better grandsons. And more or less that actually turned out to be true. Chinggis Khan's grandsons did the remainder of much of the conquering in China and in the Middle East and in Russia. This is now, as I mentioned earlier, there's only one history written in Mongolian that's left to us. But in terms of the Persian histories, that's where we get a huge treasure trove, right? There's quite a few. There's quite a few of these. I won't be able to. I'm only really able to share three. I think three today. But essentially, the Persian writings historians wrote a lot on the Mongols. But there's also Arabic text. And this one, I don't read Arabic, so I'm going to butcher this. Sirat as-Sultan Jalal al-Din Menguberti. Menguberti, they're really the same thing. And what happened was, right, Jalal al-Din Menguberti, he put up a strong fight, but nonetheless, because of Sultan Muhammad's defeats, Jalal al-Din wasn't able to turn the tide. Right? He was forced into India. Later, he just wandered around with his followers. But one of the scholars in his camp wrote a history about him. Right? So, and it was written in Arabic. Right? At that time in the Islamic world, both Persian and Arabic were languages of scholarship. So, and with Arabic, I just want to say a little more. By the time the Mongols reached the borders of Egypt, that was ruled by the Mamluks also began to write about their Mongol enemy and neighbors. Next phase of the Mongol conquest of the Islamic world, which is essentially how the Mongols got to the Egyptian border, was Chinggis Khan's grandson, Hulagu. So in 1258, Hulagu, son of Chinggis Khan's fourth son, Tule, conquers Iran and Iraq and destroys the Abbasid Caliphate based in Baghdad. And the Caliphate, as a dynasty, the Abbasids, survives in Cairo with Mamluk support, but in Baghdad, that's the end of it. Right? The Mongols essentially ruled Iraq and Iran from that point onwards. And they sacked the city. They destroyed the Beit al-Hikmat, which was the House of Wisdom, one of the greatest libraries of the time, and a lot of carnage in Baghdad. So now this conquest is noted in the earlier source Tarikh-e jahangushay, and it was also recounted in other histories written in Persian. So the Mongols, specifically Hulagu's descendants, they established their rule in Iran and Iraq, and they eventually converted to Islam, and that was quite crucial to the overall conversion of Mongols to Islam. And so essentially what happened was Mongols became Muslims. They started out as conquerors of Muslims, but then through conversion, they ended up becoming patrons of Islam, becoming Muslims themselves, a Muslim dynasty. And then that's when they really, started to take on many of the characteristics that you would expect from a Muslim dynasty. For example, patronizing, commissioning the construction of great mosques. Yeah. And with the establishment of Hulagu's state or Ulus, roughly the contours of the division of the Mongol domain among the different branches among Chinggis Khan's sons and the different branches of the family were established. So I called this slide, right, the nominal Great Mongol Ulus, because nominally there was still a Great Mongol Ulus, Yeke Mongol Ulus, but there was what you see there in the east, in Mongolia and China, that was ruled by the brother of Hulagu, Kubilai and Kubilai's descendants, and they were called the Ka'an. Ka'an and Khan, it sounds the same, but really Ka'an is a higher title. So nominally, the descendants of Kubilai were rulers of all Mongols, but in practice, other branches of the family were independent and sometimes rebelled against their rule. It's really the Ulus of Hulegu and the Ulus of the Ka'an. They were on good terms the whole time. Right? The other two, the Ulus of Juchi, remember the eldest son Juchi, and the Ulus of Chadai, the second son, remember they were often rebellious. Yes, so this is what we might call the heyday of Mongol rule in the world. Now, earlier we've seen with the history of the world conqueror, the Tarikh-e jahangushay, a Persian source, and I didn't mention this, but that was a source, that was a text written under Mongol patronage. Right? It was under the patronage of Mongol Khan, who was older brother of Hulegu and Kubilai. Now, as historians, when possible, we don't want to just look at one side, one party in a history. We also want to see what other parties, particularly their enemies, would say about them. So here now, I would like to introduce a source called the Tabaqat-e Nasiri, right, by Minhaj ad-Din Juzjani. What happened was, this Mr. Minhaj ad-Din Juzjani was a scholar who fled the Mongol invasion. He fled the Mongol invasion to India, at the time ruled by what historians also call a Mamluk dynasty, but not to be confused with the Mamluks of Egypt. Mamluk means essentially a military slave dynasty. They started out as military slaves, but they took rulership into their own hands. So the Mamluk dynasty in India afforded him protection. Tabaqat-e Nasiri, what it means is, Tabaqat, it's historical biographies in chronological stages. Tabaqat means stages, so it's really historical biographies of people, but in chronological order, if you will. And Nasiri refers to a sultan, I believe. Please correct me if I'm wrong. So it's a sultan. It was the sultan at the time. Was called Nasir Mahmud Shah. Nasir Mahmud Shah, his patron. So it's essentially historical biographies in honor of my patron, the Sultan Nasir Mahmud Shah. And so let's take a moment and let's read this little passage, shall we? An anti-Mongol passage. I'm sorry. Yes, back to it. Yeah. Okay, thank you, thank you. And so he was older than Ogadai, and as Chinggis Khan was aware that his temperament was excessively murderous and oppressive, he did not bequeath the rulership to him and assigned it to his younger brother Ogadai, right? Written in by a refugee Muslim scholar in India. And if you ask me, I believe Juice Johnny, right, in what he said, because if you think about it, Chagatai, if he's not even nice to his older brother Juchi, why would he be nice to conquered Muslim subjects, right? So partially kidding there, but yeah, essentially, if we look at this, there's no holding back, no holding back, and the about the plight of Muslims, but under Mongol rule, but particularly this Chagatai, right? This Chagatai who, if we go back a little quickly, he basically inherited Central Asia, much of the former territories of the Khwarazm Shah, Sultan Muhammad. And yes, yeah, so now that we've seen a couple primary sources, we can just imagine if we basically read them, cross-referencing each other, right? We get parts of a story that we can piece together. It won't answer all of our questions, but essentially the original sources of information, right? We just, there's quite a bit of it out there. There's quite a bit of it for us to digest. And as I understand, since we have some guests from Turkey, Chagatai, right? Chagatai, the name, right? It's a still fairly common. Well, it's a name, right, in for boys and men in Turkey, right? So the irony is that if you know someone who's named Chagatai, it's from this man. There's not another famous Chagatai in history. So he's named after Chagatai. So, and if this person happens to be a devout Muslim, then I would suggest don't tell him about the Tabakati Nasiri by Juice Johnny, because that would be upsetting. That would just be, oh man, what I get named at? Well, who's my namesake? So, sorry, nerdy, lame joke. And going on to our next primary source. As we talked about, Hulagu's descendants, right, established their rule in Iran and Iraq. And by the late 13th century, right, they converted to Islam. And under the patronage of Khazan Khan, who I believe must have been great-grandson of Hulagu, we have, he converted to Islam, and he commissioned what was called the Jamu Tawarikh, translated as Compendium of Chronicles. It was essentially meant to be a world history covering everything about history that was known to them at the time. But a very valuable part of it was the part about the Mongols, since that was closer in time and directly. The author, Rashid ad-Din Fazlullah Hamadani, he served Khazan Khan as a vizier, a minister. So definitely counts as an eyewitness account, at least when it comes to Khazan Khan. And I just selected a quick quote. This is directly about the direct record of Khazan Khan's conversion, right? In sum, at the beginning of the month of Shaban of the year 694, that should be roughly, I think, 1295, if I'm not mistaken, 1295, in the presence of Sheikh Zadeh Sadruddin Ibrahim Hamouyi, Khazan Khan, with all the emirs, meaning commanders, nobles, spoke the words of monotheism. I believe that would be the Shahada, and they all became Muslim. And importantly, right, this is a pretty straightforward account. This is a recurring pattern for the Mongols, that once a ruler like Khazan Khan converts to Islam, his followers, his noblemen, and the households under his rule would likely convert. So we tend to have mass conversions, right? And of course, once something like this happens. It's a watershed moment, right? The political culture, the changes, right? Not that they stop being Mongols, but the way they present themselves, the way they see themselves, the way that the laws would, at least to some degree, would have to give more precedence to Sharia, even if the old laws of the Mongols, the Yatsa of Chinggis Khan, were still maintained. And speaking of conversion, right, there's a somewhat of a similar story for the Ulus of Juche, right, the one in the north that subjugated the Russians, right? So what happened was in 1313 to 1341, that was the reign of Uzbek, basically Uzbek Khan, Uzbek Khan, and who was great-great-grandson of Juche, right, the eldest son of Chinggis Khan, and he converted to Islam. So essentially, what this means is, we've heard of a country called Uzbekistan. The original Uzbeks were Mongols of the Ulus of Juche. It was in the early 16th century that a branch of them came, and they went south and conquered the area that only in the 20th century became the Uzbekistan that we know of. And the Kazan Tatars in Russia, the Crimean Tatars in Crimea, they are descendants of the Ulus of Juche. So they're not speaking Mongolian anymore, but in terms of their and they certainly mixed with people of other ethnicities and cultures. But in terms of their political heritage, they're Mongols. They're Mongols, right? And it's their conversion was in great part thanks to Uzbek Khan's conversion. And I just thought it would be symbolic to put a picture of a mosque. I believe it's a 17th century mosque in Kazan, Russia. Right? Again, Kazan Tatars, they're heirs of the Ulus of Juche. Right? Very beautiful architecture we see here. So that said, right, it's somewhat of an important distinction to make, is that whereas we see the Ulus of Hulegu and the Ulus of Jahadai, they were established through conquest of existing Muslim territories. The Ulus of Juche is largely still in the steppe. It's that they made themselves just part of Islamdom by becoming Muslims themselves. Okay, having introduced 3 primary sources in Persian, I'd like to talk briefly about the use of Turkish primary sources. For the first century, for the early period, we don't have a surviving history written in Turkish, though Turkic speakers were a major component of the Mongol domain, and it was an official language in the chancellery. And so what I have here, I just took a snapshot of a letter that was written by the successor to Ogedai, Guyuk. Right? Guyuk Khan was the son and successor to Ogedai Khan. And this was a letter he wrote to the Pope, right? Pope Innocent IV. And the body of the letters in Persian, but the header, this is the header, right, is in Turkish. So very quickly, by the power of the eternal Tengri, Tengri was the sky god of the Mongols, and later on, when they converted to Islam, it basically was equated with Allah, with God. Khan of the Kur, great Ulus of the ocean. Kur probably means entire, powerful, vast. And this is our edict. Mengu Tengri Kuchinda, Kur Uluch, Ulus Nung, Pailu Nung, Hanna Yarluchamus. Yeah, so Turkic populations were quite significant in the Mongol domain, and we have chancellery short documents from the early period, but it's much later in the 15th, 16th century that we was actually started having extensive histories. And unfortunately, I don't think we'll have time to talk about them today. Very quickly, I want to talk about the Chinese primary sources. So as mentioned, Hulagu's older brothers, first Mongke, right, and then Kubilai, they finished the Mongol conquest of China, and they ruled until 1368. Yeah, so almost a century of Mongol rule in China. And there was a Chinese chancellery, and after a Chinese rebellion drove out the Mongols, the succeeding dynasty called the Ming Dynasty wrote a history of the Mongols based on Mongol court documents left over, right, by the Mongols. And that's what you see, the Yuan Shi, or history of the Yuan, on the left, Yuan Shi. And it's basically a official history of the Mongols from Chinggis Khan, who to the last ruler, Tohun Timur Khan, the last ruler to rule in China. Now, just so we know, Yuan Shi means history of the Yuan. Well, what does that mean? During the course of their rule in China, the Mongols also adopted, in addition to calling themselves the Great Mongol Ulus, they also adopted a name for their state in the Chinese tradition. Chinese states would name themselves, and they chose the name Great Yuan. They called themselves the Great Yuan, based on a quote from a Chinese classic. So, yeah, the Yuan and Mongol rule are synonymous. And to the right, this is it's called Shengwu Qinzheng Lu. It's records of the personally led campaigns of Genghis Khan. So another Chinese source on the Mongols, and it's just unfortunate. I believe there isn't a easily accessible published translation of these Chinese sources yet, so I didn't include them in the bibliography that I will share. But last I heard, in Hebrew University of Jerusalem, they're working on it. So perhaps in our lifetimes, we will see translations that's widely accessible to us. And very quickly, there are Latin. I do want to say, I'm not even going to be able to cover all the languages, right? That there are primary sources for. So today I'm not going to be able to talk about Armenian, but I should give a quick mention to Latin. So the Europeans, the Latinate world, they knew about the Mongols. They weren't conquered by the Mongols, but they had diplomatic relations with the Mongols. Originally, when they heard that Mongols like Chagatai were brutalizing Muslims, they were cheering. They were like, oh, this is ours. This is a gift from God. And then later, when the Mongols started to add Eastern Europe, they kind of changed their minds on that. But they traveled they sent emissaries to the Mongols, and this is one example of them. William of Rubruck, right, was a Franciscan friar. He was sent by King Louis IX of France in 1253 to visit the Mongols. At the time, Mongol Khan, again, an elder brother of Hulagu Khan, right? And sometimes these travelers, they're great. They're essentially the anthropologists of their age. They didn't just pay attention to, well, in fact, they would have known less about the politics, the political history, compared to the, say, sources that were written under Mongol rule, where they had the whole records of history before them. Okay, this is in this year, the army conquered this city. For them, it's more like they have hearsay about history, but they're just observing the Mongols they see. Right? If we quickly just let's just take a quick 1-minute session to read this small passage. My apologies. Okay, right. So at the beginning of this talk, I try to give a quick overview of who the Mongols are and their way of life. But really, we could have just invited Friar William to tell us. Like, it's pretty accurate. It's it. This is it. It's Mongols, in the words of a European traveler. And the original text, sorry, I couldn't find the Latin text. It's there. Of course, this one has been translated into English. And okay, this concludes basically our sampling of primary sources. As incompetent of an introduction I gave to them, please let it not reflect on the repository of knowledge that these sources are. If you have time, if you are interested in this history, please read them. Read the primary sources. Go straight for the original source of information on this chapter of history. And again, today's talk was just about the 1st century. Mongol rule really lasted quite a long time. I found this picture. I hope it's accurate. This is, right, if we ask ourselves the question, how long did quote unquote Mongol rule in the Islamic world last? Well, this is Sa'id Abdullah Khan of the Conqueror tribe, which, by the way, is the tribe of Borte, Chinggis Khan's wife, as well as the tribe of Chinggis Khan's mother. They supplied a lot of the Mongol queens. And he was Uzbek ruler of Khiva, or Khiva is basically Khorazm. Right? We talked about Khorazm Shah, a region just south of the Aral Sea. He was ruler of Khiva under the protection of, under the suzerainty of the Russian Empire, but nonetheless, he was Khan from 1918 to 20, right? Last Khan before the Russian Revolution got rid of Khans. Right? Now, he doesn't, most likely doesn't speak Mongolian, but he's certainly a Muslim. But in terms of his heritage, he's a Mongol, right? Going back to, he's a Uzbek, right? Therefore, a follower of Uzbek Khan, convert to Islam, and descendant, and of course, he's not a descendant of the Chinggis Khan's family as Conqueror, but he's a Uzbek, and they're just heirs and followers in the general sense of the Ulus of Juche, and hence Mongols. So Mongol rule in the Islamic world lasted quite a long time. Each period, each region has its own history, and we only know about these history through the primary sources. So now, if it pleases our host, Bachem, how can I share a Microsoft Word document?
You should stop sharing this doc and then share the file, the Word file, the
In
same way.
chat? Can I put it in the chat?
Oh, in the chat, you mean?
Yes. Like,
why don't we just share it on the screen, because this is gonna be.
I'd like everyone who would like to basically have a copy of, of this Word document.
I have never. Oh, okay. I see. There is an option over there in chat. You click on the file. It says file, and select the file from your computer. Upload it there. They're gonna receive.
Understood. Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, I am sending you. I believe it's been sent from me to everyone. Yes. So the primary sources we sampled, with the exception of the Chinese ones that hasn't been, at least I don't know of a translation of them. They're there. For a few of them, I provided links to publicly available translations. Others, unfortunately, I think we may have to buy, but if you do an internet search, you might come across a free resource. But so I hope you enjoy at least one or two of them. All right, at some point, it's grow up with a primary source on the Mongols. If reading these primary sources, again, as we sample them, they're human, they're accessible. They just give us a window into people. So